I'm very intimidated to be back in Massachusetts indirectly. That's where I did my PhD over a little bit over a decade ago. And I wish I was there in person. I wish I was back in a bit of my intellectual homeland in some ways, but it's extremely nice to be able to join you. You will have to forgive the lateness of the time and hopefully not the lateness of my brain when I express myself today. It's 10 p.m. where I am here in Barcelona. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of our work with you, but excuse any of the non-rational thought I might express. This is actually a very collective mission. I use the word in the title, but in some ways, our research is a form of mission as well, but it's really not only what I do as research or coordinate, it's really the research of our broader laboratory, which is the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, located within the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, a large public university, and an institute that's called ICTA, Institute for Environmental Sciences and Technology. And so because I'm an urban planner by training, I have to ask this question. Can urban planning move beyond the current green mission? And can it do that in ways that push us closer to an equity-driven green city? So just a tiny bit of context about the lab. We are a multidisciplinary lab formed by people across career stages, and we started working together approximately 6 years ago, trying to bridge research, community practice, and planning around urban environmental justice across both sides of the Atlantic. So we are from many places across North America and Europe, and we have a deep emphasis on trying to bridge research in urban environmental planning with that in public health, in feminist political ecology as well, looking also at the political economy of urban development and financialization of housing, and how those dynamics also tend to impact urban environmental planning and create inequities on the ground. Some of us also work around transitions to degrowth and alternative economic development models that can both question the domination of growth, but also the domination of development being brought to communities. Something I also highlight in the talks I have the chance to give is how we also try in the lab, in ICTA, to build an ethics of care in academia and an ethics of care with and for the communities we try to work with, but also together as academics, a bit embedded in a precarious system, let's put it that way, and in a very neoliberalized academia in Spain. So to delve into the talk, the question I want to address is that one. Does Cities Green mission respond to equity and justice emergencies, or does it contribute or even accelerate climate and other environmental inequalities? And so I start from the state of affairs, the historic enduring inequalities that exist by race, class, and ethnicity in access to green space. That's what I have called the green divide. And that's an example that you see here in Barcelona, a divide in access to public parks in the neighborhood of Turó on the left, El Parc del Turó being this lush space protected and surrounded by luxury housing, historic park, and on the right, a park that's been there for 30 years in the neighborhood of Trinitat Vella, called the Parc de la Trinitat, that might be a new amenity. But here the question of access is really to be disputed, knowing the enduring proximity to gray and contaminated infrastructure around the park. And we see those types of inequalities, these historic inequalities repeated, of course, in relationship to access to green space that might protect residents against heat island effects. Again, two contrasts in Barcelona, La Plaza Ángel Pestaña and in the neighborhood of La Prosperidad, very big center of heat islands, and on the right, the renovated Passeig Sant Joan that has really been assorted with green infrastructure and stormwater management systems. And so what we are seeing over the last decade or so, and what we're really working with, is the way in which not only are cities trying, let's say, to address to some extent this green divide, but they are really widely adopting green infrastructure for their multifunctionality and their low-cost solutions. One of those benefits, which Theo very nicely articulated, is the relationship between green space and health. So a lot of the research that we do in the lab, for example, has shown that more contact with nature is associated with better mental health through improved sleeping patterns. It's also associated to reducing hotter summer temperatures, and at the same time, preventing increased death, thanks, for example, to increased tree cover. And so we see these benefits, let's say these trickle-down benefits that the public health community and others have sold in relationship to green space, and that actually have also underpinned and supported the global green mission that we see now. The orthodoxy about greening cities through nature-based solutions, through green infrastructure, in ways that are also being projected, that are being envisioned in plans, in broader programs, and, for example, here in Boston, in the rendering of the Boston Harbor Plan, which is a 72 square kilometers greening process of all Boston waterfronts that are meant to protect the city against sea level rise. And so not only are cities doing this greening to address those wide scale, let's say, challenges and harness benefits, but it is actually this green mission is part of a competition between cities to be the greenest, to be the most sustainable, to be the most livable. And they are also being supported by a series of awards and prizes that cities are applying to. In the background, you see the city of Nantes in France, which won in 2013 the European Green Capital Award. And so this competition between cities is a way to attract investment, is a way to project a city on, let's say, a broader international scale, in some ways also to convert an image of maybe a rusty city or gray city into a city that can attract new residents and new classes. And that's where, in some ways, the social benefits of greening start not being, necessarily articulated in ways that can be that universal. And so our critique in the lab is the following. Great, you have this green mission, you have these plans, you have these projects, but for whom in the mid and the long term? To what extent are actually intersectional, current, and midterm social climate, vulnerabilities accounted for? And so the main argument has to do with a concept that I tried to work with a few years ago, which is called green LULUs, green locally unwanted land uses, which is very much driven by the planning literature. But the idea here is very simple, that different types of green infrastructure can actually be undesirable in racially mixed and working class neighborhoods because of the environmental health and climate inequities that they can recreate and that are being denounced themselves by residents and community groups of those neighborhoods. And so in that sense, going back a bit to a domain that I work on a lot, which is climate adaptation and urban greening for climate adaptation, we see here forming, and it's the argument of the talk, a quadruple form of climate injustice, the displacement factor, the displacement by climate resilient infrastructure, being really the dimension I want to explore a little bit more in the talk today. So from a theoretical standpoint, what are we talking about? We're talking, of course, about the literature on green privilege, but we're also talking about the literature on environmental and climate gentrification. So when Sarah Dooding coined the term environmental gentrification in 2009, she saw it as this process where public green space, if you want to put it as an independent variable, was leading to the displacement or exclusion of economically vulnerable groups as kind of the outcome under an environmental ethic. So greening creates or accelerates gentrification. what we work with on the lab is a little bit more in the idea, first with the idea of a green paradox. So greening does not have all of the positive social benefits it is meant or it is sold to bring. But what we also work with is the idea that no matter whether greening accelerates, contributes, or creates gentrification, if you are in a gentrifying neighborhood that's being greened and that you are pushed out, there will be a segregation process where you will be moved away from this new access to nature, and there will be in the end a divisive access to nature through displacement and segregation, which I know this figure is a little bit messy here, but what we want to complexify a bit in the argument that Sarah Juling was articulating is against the fact that there are first three different processes by which greening accelerates or produces gentrification, which is to the building or marketing or higher end homes, through increased land and property values and costs, and through the exclusive green use of amenities. So that's kind of the, let's say, the mechanisms that we see. But we also see that gentrification can, as you see on the right, produce new and more greening, new rounds of greening, which itself can intensify gentrification. So there are many feedback loops there as well. There are also contexts where greening directly displaces socially vulnerable groups, and that's much more frequent in the global south, where informal settlements are being wiped out to create some green belts or some protective areas, but actually to the detriment of those groups to be able to stay in their land, while at the same time, luxury developments can remain unabated. And so in that sense, again, kind of these multiple, let's say, a bit finer relationships of exclusion that greening can bring about. So if we think from a scoping standpoint, and what we are seeing on the ground, what we try to do in the lab, and that's where now I dig in a little bit more into our studies, is to measure what's the magnitude of green gentrification, where does it take place, and what dimensions does it have? And for us, green gentrification shows displacement and dispossession through financial, physical, aesthetical, and social-cultural dynamics. I won't walk today through all of those, but I will point at some of them. I want to also highlight that I'll present very brief results of our studies, which are part of the broader project that was just finished a few months ago, which is called itself Green Lulus. And that was a study of 30 cities at a very specific level, but overall 100 cities in North America and Europe, looking at the mechanisms of green gentrification, where it's taking place, both spatially and qualitatively. And so I'll just dig through some of those sub-studies. So first, from a financial standpoint, how do we see this speculation and this displacement take place? What we first did when we started the project was to portray, let's say, green trajectories, was to gather how 99 cities in North America and Europe, so think about places like Milwaukee, Seattle, Austin, Boston, Washington, San Francisco, so mid-sized American cities, and in Europe, places like Barcelona, Amsterdam, Dublin, Sheffield, Milan. So again, also mid-sized cities. What we've tried to do here is, okay, what has been the identity? What has been the branding that cities have made of themselves over the last 20, 30 years or so? So we went back all the way to 1990. And at the same time, what has been kind of evolutions of cost of living and affordability in those cities? So in the first quantitative study that we did, we found that there was a high association between high levels of urban green brandings and high levels of unaffordability in our cities, which means that basically the more green the city's branding itself, the more unaffordable it is. A place like Vancouver here on the right is very much at the epicenter of those types of dynamic of limited elite access to the benefits of greening. What we also did was to interview developers in 15 cities where we asked them what value do they find in greening, how do they use it, and how do they strategize it. And so what we found here through these really insightful interviews is a form of urban green grabbing, a form of, let's say, land being taken advantage of, rent gaps being taken advantage of by investors, by developers, land that they then green or build luxury buildings next to green land in ways that can help them accrue value. And so in kind of this triangle of green grabbing logic, we see that developers are able to get easier loans, easier forms of financial support or permits if they show that they are, greening a neighborhood, contributing to the financing or a park, or again, kind of building in a way that's a little bit more climate resilient, and that might include landscaping and access to public parks that need to be included in the real estate project. And in the end, for them, that allows them to extract greater rent because of the higher prices that they can charge. On top of it, there is a form of discourse of doing good, of green being good, that those developers, that whole real estate industry has been also able to harness and articulate. So a very deep green grabbing logic that we've seen in those 15 cities. And I don't go too much in detail. One of these very strong symbols of green grabbing is Bosco Verticale in Milan, those two skyscrapers where the 1,500 plants or the 900 trees that you see there can absolutely not compensate for, first, the carbon cost of building those skyscrapers and for the social price that residents have to pay if they want to live there, which is close to 7 million euros for a unit. So again, a form of green illusion in these global kind of green investment strategies by the real estate industry. Then if you look at physical forms of green gentrification, what do we see? We see here, and that's again, kind of the cities we've worked with, what we see is that green spaces, and that's the overall hypothesis we've worked with, that green spaces that have been created in a certain time period are, let's say, explaining gentrification in a following period, considering a series of covariates. And so in that overall study that we just published last year, we see different patterns where, again, here it's very much a straight line spatial and quantitative analysis, where on the one hand, we are able to identify and geolocate all green spaces built in a city between 1990 and 2016. Then we're also able to build gentrification scores, composite gentrification scores at the census tract level. And then through that, we are able then to compute the extent to which we find citywide gentrification trends through Bayesian statistics. And I won't enter in detail. So then we find different patterns, right? So for example, we find that Atlanta, Louisville, and Seattle show a sustained green gentrification at the citywide level throughout the entire study period in the 1990s, 2000, and 2010. We also find that places like Barcelona had green gentrification start as a process in the 2000s and has recently accelerated as actually Barcelona has become more famous for its green work, for its biodiversity protection work, and has also articulated an image internationally as a climate leader. Then we also see green gentrification occurring only in the later period, which is the last decade, in Austin, Montreal, Copenhagen, and Detroit. And that's very interesting because Copenhagen has always been a green city, but it's been more in the last decade, and not actually also follows the same pattern, that it has used this greening strategy as a way to attract new real estate investments, international capital, and also international elites. And so the role of greening as a marketing tool, as an investment tool, has really been harnessed by city officials. Then we also see in this study, which was very complex and took us a long time to do, different types of green gentrification. So for example, on the left, you see what we call subsidiary green gentrification. That is, greening plays a role in explaining gentrification, but it's a smaller role. There are other things going on. For example, in Washington, D.C., real estate and commercial development. In the middle category, which is the integrated green gentrification, is greening that plays a role that is more or less on par with other gentrification drivers, such as real estate development or new transit lines, in explaining gentrification. And then in the box on the right, greening is the main variable explaining why gentrification takes place at the citywide level. Atlanta, Austin, Copenhagen, places like Nantes, Vancouver, or Montreal. And you can see here a majority of American cities, by the way. So that's also a phenomenon that you see more in the US. Then what we also see is that if you try to break down the types of green spaces that most contribute to gentrification, we find different dynamics. If we take all regions together, it is parks and to some extent greenways recently constructing. So that's all what you see in orange, let's say, and in purple, that play a greater role in green gentrification. In the US, it's park, greenways, and to some extent, community garden, especially those that are very aestheticized, that are of larger size. In Europe, it tends to be more greenways, and in Canada, it tends to be more gardens and some nature preserves. Now, from a social cultural standpoint, how do we notice green gentrification? And so here, that's really where the interview that we conducted, and we have more than 500 interviews throughout all of our cities, where we conducted field work 3 years ago, just before COVID, where we really also try to understand what's going on in the lived experiences of these new green spaces, according to long-term residents. So in Montreal, what do people report? We have a lot more police in the neighborhood that we used to have and kind of do patrols of the park. So it's harder to have a healthy mix of people in places. In Dublin, we feel so excluded from it that it's a deep anger, it's a big anxiety, and a deep feeling of isolation. And in Washington, where there's a new park being planned that's called the 11th Street Bridge Park, residents have told us when they are done with the park, most of us probably won't be here to enjoy it. We will be good enough to serve you Slurpees and hot dogs at the River Festival, but not to live there. Now, if you also try to break down gentrification in a different, in green gentrification, let's say in a subset of it, that's when climate gentrification comes in. And what does that mean? It means that we are looking at green spaces that have been built, or green infrastructure that had been built as climate protective spaces that also play a role in creating exclusive climate protection, maladaptation, and unequal climate security. We've worked a little bit with the definition. And so here, in this table that compares 4 neighborhoods that have been at the forefront of green urban planning: Boston, Philly, Amsterdam, and Barcelona. The trends, let's say the common trends that we tend to see, which are the ones on the upper side here of the table, is that, yes, residents perceive the social, environmental, and climate benefits of those projects, but they already see a physical displacement from them. In Boston and in Barcelona, they sense a perceived threat that this is going to continue. And then in basically all of those places, especially so for Boston and Philly, a sense that new developments that are coming up, like those that you see on the right, are exclusive, and that this is resilient, privatized greening for others. And in the future, they have this explicit fear of green gentrification and an enduring, actually also at the same time, unequal access and benefits to green spaces. That's one of these examples in Barcelona, a green corridor that serves as new playgrounds together with stormwater management infrastructure that are being surrounded by the luxury buildings and hotels that you see here on the picture. We've also looked at this relationship in a quantitative manner, so not only through interview that I was describing here, but if you take the example of Philly, my colleague Galia Chokri has done an amazing work at, on the one hand, identifying where the acreages of green resilient infrastructures have gone in the city between 2011 and 2016, and which are all of the blue circles that you see, and also measured gentrification scores, which are the darker, let's say, corridors, the darker polygons here on the map. And so what did she find? She found this unequal climate protective infrastructure, where what you can see is that the neighborhoods, the census tracts that most gentrified between 2000 and 2010 are those that most attracted green resilient infrastructure in the subsequent years. So you have this ability of gentrifiers, as I was describing earlier, to attract urban greening. And then she also looked at where Black residents and Latino and Hispanic residents, have gone over the last few years, and then what also has that meant from the point of view of access to greening. And so the areas on the left that are the red ones and the one in orange on the right map are the areas that have gained the greatest population of Blacks and Hispanic residents. And what you can see is that there are also those that have least gained climate resilient infrastructure. So there is definitely an exclusion from the benefits of urban greening by race in Philly, and thus this unequal protection to impacts such as heat or stormwater. The latest study also that we all did together and that Galia led has also been able to pinpoint the areas that are most vulnerable to future gentrification due to past trends of gentrification, as well as to where green investment is meant to go. And so here again, you see a spatial correlation that's very strong between the areas that are very sensitive to gentrification, that are greater at risk of being gentrified, which are the ones in the black circles, and where green gentrification, where urban greening is planned to come. And that's interesting in the sense that, again, we're not looking only at past trends, but what might happen. And so if cities are able to let's say, map those vulnerable areas, this is also where greater policy action in relationship to anti-displacement can take place. One of the aspects that we've more recently worked with is the question of urban greening and what we call compounded environmental racisms. And so going back a bit to all of the cities in which we have conducted field work, some of which you see here, we've seen kind of 6 ways in which urban greening has also on the ground, both for climate purpose or, let's say general environmental, social, and health benefits, compounded environmental racism. First, because in those neighborhoods, land contamination still remains. Doesn't mean that because you are green that you have cleaned up toxins or air pollution. You also see ongoing legacies or perceived legacies of land theft, settler colonialism, segregation, and displacement because of the ways in which this greening is being top-down done, is being marketed, is being branded. You also have the sense that urban green spaces are exclusive and privileged in the context of white supremacy, and that if residents want to access housing that is either affordable housing or market-priced housing that is in proximity to urban greening, they will face economic racism and this difficult access to housing. At the same time, there is enduring territorial stigmatization in greening neighborhoods, especially norms of usage, cultural habits, social recreation activities conducted by people of color that are being surveyed, that are being controlled. I talked a little bit about this earlier. And then finally, also a sense that there is a greater lack of political rights that remain enduring and a lack of racial representation in the greening city. And I really wanted to dig into this because in the green gentrification literature, the racial aspect still tends to be a bit too glossed over, if you will. I want to finish quickly with equity-driven alternatives for green and just cities. Where do we go from there? And what can we highlight as positive experiences or positive insights into the way cities are doing greening in a little bit more of an equitable manner? First, the main argument that we have developed based on all of these research and data we have gathered in North America and Europe is that you need a mix. You need a mix of anti-displacement and equitable or inclusive green development tools. We published that report, which is on the website for free of our lab just a year ago, Policy and Planning Tools for Urban Green Justice. And so to avoid the elite capture of urban greening, we kind of see three aspects here. The need to create reparative climate infrastructures, the anti-displacement tools and policies, and also the democratization anyway, of climate finance governance. So what does that mean in practice? It means that you have a series of tax incentives or taxes or tax breaks that can address anti-gentrification, investment in public and social housing, different levels of inclusionary zoning, different actions that are meant to address rent increases, as well as broader right to stay or right to return policies, which is what Portland, Oregon has to address green gentrification and to especially put an accent on affordable and secure housing. And then what we also see, from these senses, from these perceptions that greening can be exclusive, that you need to have inclusive green amenities. So for example, turning vacant land over to community groups so that they can farm that land or they can create different uses for it that's maybe more informal, that's more invisible, that's much less glossy, but it can also fulfill other social benefits. And I won't enter into many of those tools, but let's say we've tried to kind of compare them together and kind of bring them together as well to see what type of mixes can come together. One example of a city that's trying to address green gentrification well is Nantes. Nantes has had, over the last 2 decades, a very strong equality-driven policy for green space, meaning that all residents must be living within 300 meters of a green area. And even though it does have flagship projects that have attracted tourists, that have attracted new higher-end housing, it has really also tried to privilege over the last few years a bit more of this informal greening that I was mentioning. It has also planned, built and finance eco-districts in working class neighborhoods, which is really well done. And all of those units that more working class residents are living in are sorted by community gardens. So that's a really nice access that they also have. Nantes has a planning tool, which is called a ZAC, which is when you have a large post-industrial landscape that you want to redevelop, the city and the metropolitan area come together to decide on land use, to decide on which types of companies can build on different lots, and at the end of the day, how to equalize uses and avoid speculation as much as possible. And as part of the ZAC, one of the very progressive inclusionary zoning rules is that 56% of all new units are directed for public and affordable housing. And I can tell you that this is being enforced. That's not being, in the end, bought out by a developer. So that works pretty well. And Nantes now, that's the way it is, has greened and blued a lot of its riverbanks, a lot of post-industrial landscapes like the one in the middle, which is called the Ile de Nantes. And at the same time, created a diversity, especially the top left and then the bottom pictures of these social and public housing that are very desirable, that are very, architect also built, and that also have to themselves a sense of pride and a sense that residents have been able to co-design them with architects, and then also have these community gardens you can see at the bottom left picture. So Nantes is really trying to do well in relationship to gentrification. Barcelona is also doing quite well. So Barcelona has a big program of pacifying street, which is called the super blocks. 3x3 blocks of streets are being traffic calm, that are converted into green spaces. You also have broader avenues that are all being greened. And what the city has done is really work on new housing regulations at the city level, both in the construction of new social and public housing, but on regulations of short-term rentals, new hotel constructions, new commercial spaces like cafes and restaurants that have a very strong attraction for tourists, but are also contributing to speculation and to really this mass tourism that's a plague in the city, and has itself added 6,600 units of new public construction, either through vacant land being converted like the one on the right, but also just buying old buildings and converting them into public housing. So the city is really putting this effort around the new super blocks and saying these are areas that we know are sensitive to green gentrification and we need to act upon them. And that's, again, another way that the city, all of the different dots are different domain of action that are coming together to support the greening and have a very strong social emphasis in relationship to the greening. Just to finish, from a grassroots standpoint, how do groups organize and how do they address housing and greening simultaneously and operate to achieve justice in greening neighborhoods? And so what we see here is the role of multi-sectoral coalitions that strengthen what we see as community infrastructures, that is social, economic, and political capacities of residents against exclusive greenwashing. So I was, just describing before what, let's say, cities are doing, within the planning office, within the housing office, but here you also have bottom-up coalition buildings of nonprofits together with residents and activists that are building the social, economic, and political capacity. And so what are we talking about? We are talking about cities that are, organizations and groups that are coming together around care-driven organizing, transformational justice organizing, and in the end, how can residents come together around farming, around ecological education, around, for example, kayaking activities for kids on a green canal, in ways that build social capacity through attachment to place and sense of community. There's also a strong emphasis on this economic capacity with development from within and ownership of change and ownership of development through self-funding programs or procurements for the green economy, and at the same time for different types of infrastructure, such as schools, such as after-school programs that can also support a broader, let's say, economy at the neighborhood level. And finally, a strong role given to political capacity to have this ability to articulate, for example, via data science, that gentrification is taking place, that it's accelerating, and that residents need a greater security in relationship to their homes and a sense of ownership over what's happening in terms of investments in their neighborhoods. One of these great examples that we always give is what's happening in Washington, D.C., around also a more emancipatory green justice. I won't go too much in detail here, but the whole community building around the 11th Street Bridge Park project shows how even before the park is built, it hasn't been built yet, there is an equitable development plan that's being developed, that's being deployed by our community land trust. There is also nonprofits that are building workers, cooperatives, and that are also building a green economy around Black residents in this neighborhood called Anacostia. And finally, a very, very remarkable process as well is a lawsuit that an African-American lawyer has filed on behalf of residents that were displaced from a demolished public housing development called Berry Farm, which you see here on the bottom right, asking for residents to have the right to come back as the neighborhood is being redeveloped into a mixed use area and as it's being greened as well. So again, mobilization, civic action also having, of course, a very prominent role in a more equal green city. So just to conclude, yes, urban greening and green space, we repeat it all the time, are vital to climate, ecological, and human health. However, achieving equity will require also questioning the exclusion that are embedded in the green city orthodoxy. And I will finish with one interview that we have the chance to conduct with the lab, and that is part of a broader project, which is called The Green Divide. And let me reshare my screen just for 5 minutes, and to invite you afterwards, if you'd like, to navigate the Green Divide. And so this is an online web documentary, which is also a tool that we have built with activists to disseminate and to try to amplify struggles. And so you have 6 cities that are on the platform: Barcelona, Nantes, Montreal, Boston, Washington, and Portland. And the platform is organized by cities, neighborhood, the stories of these neighborhoods, and then you have this little video tour that tells you a bit how to make it work. So if I click on cities, for example, here I have a short summaries of how urban greening has panned out in those places, which type of inequalities are the historic one. Then we zoom in on the neighborhood level. So for example, Barcelona, but let me go back to Portland because that's the one I wanted to show today. So in Portland, we have the neighborhood of Cully and the broader East Portland. Here you will have access to the videos, but for example, if you look here, you have, where each of the organizations are located in Portland. Let me go back here. Oops. Here for a minute, and then you also have then access to the 3 videos that represent a diversity of activist views. So if I click on Verde here, it brings me to the YouTube interview.
Right now, we're in the heart of the Cully neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, and that's where Verde is located and where we've been doing our work for the past decade and a half. We work at the intersection of environmental justice, economic justice, and racial justice. And the reason why we do that is because neighborhoods like Cully are environmental justice neighborhoods, which is disproportionately dotted with trash heaps and car scrap yards and other sort of industrial uses. There's also a serious lack of green space and parks. So when we talk about building environmental wealth, we're not just talking about the green assets themselves, such as parks, paved streets, tree plantings, bioswales. We're also talking about building the political power of community members to develop the political analysis and the tools to be able to advocate for long standing policy changes that really impact the way that they live their lives. There is a pervasive narrative of Portland being a green and sustainable city where everyone rides bikes and goes to the farmer's market and composts. And there's this idea of this green utopia, but that is contradictory to the realities of the lived experiences of so many Portlanders. We've always been an extremely divided city. We have a lot of racial disparities here. Rapid gentrification and displacement has disproportionately impacted the Black community members here and all other communities of color. That's the work that we've tasked ourselves with doing, is saying, no. All these sort of green investments that are happening are making other people wealthy. Wider, wealthier communities is where we're seeing those investments. We can do that ourselves in a different way, like Cully Park, for example, which we turned a 25-acre former quarry and then turned into a landfill. We did the advocacy, we did the work for fundraising, and then we actually built the park itself, creating jobs. I mean, that longevity of that vision of creating environmental wealth, a park, took so many years and so many hands, but the vision came from within our communities, and we acted upon that. Our approach has continued to be that we want to build these environmental assets, not for future residents, but we want to build it with current residents who are Cully community members for the benefit of Cully community members, as to not perpetuate this green divide that we see, which is wealthier, wider communities being able to essentially have these green enclaves in which they will be protected from the devastating impacts of a very uncertain future. We do not want that. We want to be in control and understand how to harness these resources and to ensure that this can be a driver for sustainability and for environmental wealth, and not just for gentrification, displacement, and the perpetuation of a green gap, or as we can say, a green divide.